Thought you were going to be there, mate. Honestly, that shook me a bit. It's great to have you, Matt. All the best.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Morning, church. It is really good to see you this morning. And if you're watching online or just relax and settle in, because I think God's got a lot to say to us this morning. We're going to learn some science. We're going to learn some history. And I think possibly God has got some challenges for us this morning. It was really interesting listening to what Emma had to say at the beginning. And maybe some of what she was saying is going to connect in with what I am going to be saying later this morning. I'm just putting it out there. Those of you that know me, you'll know this is true. But I'm just putting it out there. I was never much good at science at school. The truth is I wasn't much good at school, if we're honest, but particularly science. The school I went to, we split our science up. So we had biology, which was kind of okay, I think, if I'm honest, because I kind of fancied the teacher. And so I enjoyed biology. We had chemistry, which to me seems like it should be really exciting, because you're kind of mixing stuff together and making new things happen. But somehow my chemistry teacher made it sound really boring. And then we had physics, which I didn't really understand, but there was something about it that pulled me in. That was gravity. Oh, good, excellent. I'm glad you're awake. That was my little science joke. But no, there was something about physics. I think because I didn't really understand it, I thought, no, this is really exciting. And actually, I've kind of made it a bit of a rule for my life to sort of begin to try and understand something that I thought I could never understand. Anyway, there was something about science that was taught to me, not by my science teacher, but by a guy in the church I went to. And he discipled me, really, as when I first became a Christian. But he was a physicist. And he helped out at the youth group as well. And his lessons were always fantastic, because he tried to get science into everything. Anyway, one session, we were talking about murder ball. Now, murder ball is basically a game we invented, which is rugby without any rules. So you just had to get, instead of a ball, a piece of chalk from one end of the room to the other end of the room. And if you could draw a cross, an X on the floor at the other end, then you scored a point. That was about it. That was about the rules, okay? So the chalk ended up getting broken up into about 10 different pieces. So in effect, there are 10 balls going around. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. Anyway, but I was talking to this science teacher about the injuries that I always seem to cause in murder ball. And Chris, this science teacher, said, well, Matt, it's all about momentum. And I was like, momentum? And he started going into it. He said, it's a physical force when you multiply mass, which I've got quite a lot of, and velocity. Now, I don't start with a lot of velocity, but when I get going, it's quite hard to stop. And he said, basically, it's just size times speed. And he said, when you put those two things together, you're going to get a lot of injuries when you come to murder ball. He said, think of it like an oil tanker. When an oil tanker gets going, it's really hard for it to turn around and change direction. And if it runs into something, that thing is going to come off worse. Now, I want you to hold this idea of momentum in your heads as we go through this Isaiah passage. Because I kind of think churches are a bit like oil tankers. When we get going, we're very difficult to stop, but we're also very difficult to turn round. We're very difficult to change direction of or in. And the truth is, we experience momentum in other parts of our life too, including our spiritual lives. I mean, don't put your hands up here, but if you get a bit bored of me talking, have a little think. What's the momentum? Oh, thanks. I'm glad you found it funny. She's already bored of me. No, have a little think. What is the momentum of your personal spiritual life right now? Are you size and speed moving on really fast? Or have you kind of slowed down? Or are you heading in a direction and it's difficult to turn round? Whatever it is, momentum has kind of been described as a series of small wins that pave the way for larger wins. But in order to overcome momentum, you've got to overcome two large forces. This is true in science, and it's also true in our lives. The first is what's called inertia. Inertia is the tendency to do nothing or to remain unchanged. And the second is resistance, the things that affect and slow down your momentum. And there are things that cause inertia and things that cause resistance in our personal spiritual walk. And they're also true for our churches too. Momentum is hard to build, and it's even harder to maintain. But momentum can be a real game changer. So hold that thought for a moment as we go into Isaiah. You've come to the end of this long series, Living a Liberated Life. And you've had various talks from various people about how to live this kind of liberated or set free life. By better asking or better connecting or better disentanglement. And you can catch up with the previous talks on the website. This is the last one of this series. To flourish through better trusting. And we're given this passage from Isaiah. And it's our reading. It's a bit small there, but I deliberately put it all on one slide there. But we've had it read to us. And this reading comes from the middle of a book. Just to give you a little bit of background for this. Isaiah, he prophesied, or he spoke about 700 years before Christ, before Jesus. And at this point, the nation of Israel has split. It's split into two. It's split into Judah in the south and Israel in the north. And the split has basically occurred because the nation asked God for a king, and God reluctantly said, well, all right, but it'll come with some challenges. And the nation split because they couldn't agree on who they wanted for king. And you can read more of that in the book of 1 Kings if you're interested. So 10 tribes, 10 of the 12 tribes went north to become or to stay as Israel, and 2 gave up their inheritance as the people of God and went south and became Judah. Now, in fact, later on, the Assyrians would come in and smash this northern kingdom. But at this point, they're 2 separate kingdoms. Interesting, just as a little aside, if you're into your Bible, which I hope a lot of us are, when you next come to read the story of the prodigal son, read it through the lens of Israel and Judah split and the wanting of the prodigal sons to come home. It adds a new perspective to a story. Anyway, Go back. You come to Israel, and to Isaiah. He's one of the most well-known prophets, and he's well known because he predicts the coming of Jesus, the coming of the Messiah, in chapter 53. And generally speaking, overall, this book is a book of sharp contrasts. Okay, you've got Isaiah juxtaposing terrifying warnings of judgment and destruction with real uplifting promises of hope and prosperity. And he holds these two things together. And actually, he prophesied under the reign of 4 Judean kings, and then ultimately met his death under the 5th king, the real evil king Manasseh. And he's speaking to this nation that's turned a deaf ear to God. Instead of serving him with humility and offering love to their neighbours, they just offer meaningless sacrifices and go on with what they want to do, thinking that God will still love them because they once were part of the people of God. They've turned their back on him and they've alienated himself from them. And we come to this chapter 43, which actually you probably noticed as it was read to us is really a bit of a retelling of the classic Exodus story, where Israel are released from captivity and God sets them free in a new promised land. And the first bit that was read to us is retelling that story, followed by this assurance that God is going to do something new. And this has happened probably about, 550 BC, something like that, midway through what's called the exile. So the people of God have been taken into captivity by the Babylonians. And they're found somewhere between 900 and 1,700 miles from home. Again, if you're interested in this, the reason why there's disparity between the two numbers, 900 and 1,700, is it depends how you count it. If you count it as the crow flies, it's 900 miles. If you count it, as they called it, as the rivers flow, so if you follow the river, it's about 1,700 miles. If you took the shortcut, the direct route, you go through 900 miles of burning desert. And it's hard, but it's quicker. If you want to know more about that, read the book of Daniel and the book of Jeremiah. But in effect, that's just the background to our story. And Isaiah 43, Israel and Judah actually are stuck. They're stuck somewhere between the past and the future. They've got little hope for the future, even though they knew the past. And I just want to put a pause here. And I say this because I love you as a church. And maybe this moves into a little bit of application for us. But we're speaking of an event 2,500 years ago. We're speaking to the people of God who are stuck. And they're looking at the past with rose-tinted spectacles. And they look at the future with fear because it's unknown. And I wonder, is this the place we're at? Now, of course, that's a question honed on us as individual Christians. Are we stuck? But also it's aimed at us as church. And I say that because sometimes the chains that bind us are of our own making. In my job, I spend a lot of time visiting churches. That's what I do. I visit churches and talk about youth work with them. I meet many, many, many churches who are desperate for a youth work in their church. And they hark back to the golden years of Sunday school when there were hundreds of kids coming. They talk of a time where the church was full of families and adults. Yet, when I give them 10 things they could do to open the possibility of that happening again, they're scared and they won't do them. Because, quote, they might lose the people they've got. And I hear that time and time and time again. Somehow, churches, and I'm a part of one, so I'm looking at myself too, somehow we get stuck between the past and the future. Momentum has left us. Inertia and resistance has taken hold. And I can see that in many, many churches. And it's true of the church that I'm a member of too. And our reading starts with what Isaiah is saying. But it's not Isaiah, it's God speaking. God says this, it says this is what the Lord says. And what does he have to say to the people of God who are stuck? Well, first of all, he does remind them of the past. Verses 16 and 17, and I've totally forgotten where I'm meant to be. I think, no, not quite there. Verses 16 and 17 are Israel's foundation story. The UK, we can't really remember that far back. But if you're American sitting here or listening online, your foundation story is one of the Pilgrims and the Revolutionary War and the founding of who you are. And maybe we as a church should look back to our foundation story as we started. It is good to remember and to celebrate the past. Celebrating what has happened in the past is not inertia. It's not bad, it's good. Every year the Jews celebrated or continued to celebrate their Passover. A true celebration of what God has done for them. In a few minutes, we're going to celebrate the past that has an impact on the present and into the future. They told stories of, remember when? Remember when he did that? Remember when she did that? But in the midst of that celebration, they also remember the tough times. It's not rose-tinted spectacles. They remember the tough times. In the Passover feast, they talk about the tears and the bondage represented by salt water and bitter herbs. They remember the past, they celebrate the past, but it's with clear, open eyes. Kind of think of it this way if you're a bit confused. We've all been in this place, I'm sure. When you're newly married, you kind of go out and you buy some furniture, don't you? And you buy a new sofa. It's brand new. Even if it's not brand new, it's new to you. You've got this new sofa. And I guarantee you, parents, you put the rule in, you're not allowed to eat and drink on that sofa. Because it's new. We don't want any spillages on it. You're barely allowed to sit on it. I mean, that's what happened in my family. You're only allowed to sit on it on special occasions, And that represents kind of hope and it represents the new relationship, your new marriage, and you've spent your hard-earned money on this. But of course, as the years roll on, it becomes familiar, doesn't it? You start eating and drinking on it, and it's molded to fit your butt. And you have spilt some drinks on it on occasions, and the kids bounce on it, and the family's grown up around this sofa, and it becomes a part of who you are. But then there comes a time where you think we really should get a new one. But you can't quite bear to throw it away, can you? You can't quite bear to throw it away because you remember the good times that were had in and on and around the sofa. You don't take it to the rubbish dump straight away. What happens? You put it in the conservatory or the den for the kids because it's not good enough for you, but it's good enough for the kids. Doesn't that happen in churches? Anyway, so you put it in the conservatory or the den. It's not quite serving its use anymore, but you can't quite get rid of it. And then you roll on a few more years, and it's still there, and nobody sits on it now because the springs have come through. And you can't even quite remember the good old days because the sofa you've now got is moving into that phase. And then it comes time to move house. And that old sofa has become a millstone around your neck. And you can't quite work out how you're going to get it to the dump now. And as an observation, churches are fantastic at starting new things, starting new projects, starting new things with brand new names. We're very, very bad at stopping things. Because we want to keep them going, because they did some good. But actually, if we're not careful, they just become memorials and millstones. I don't know if this is true, because I've never been there, but the story goes that in the Apple, the company Apple offices, the door into the CEO's office is branded and marked with Sun Life Computers logo. Because it used to be their offices. And of course, who are Sun Life Computers now? And it's a reminder that if you don't keep going, don't keep making the changes, you'll become obsolete. Now, obviously referring back to Israel's exodus, from Egypt, God does remind Israel, he was the one who made a way through the sea. He was the one who gave them a path through the mighty waters. He was the one who led the Egyptian army into the middle of the dried up Red Sea and let the towering walls come down. He was the one who extinguished and snuffed them out. It was his task. And then, and it's really astonishing, isn't it? Even though God has said, I did all this good thing, he then says, forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. Hold on. We go, hold on. Do you really want us to forget? I mean, forgetting God was kind of the sin that led to the exile. But God isn't saying, forget me. He's saying, forget some of the things I've done. Don't lean into them. Don't hold on to them. Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. You see, the people kept thinking that God was talking about the recent past of the exile. And they've been experiencing that for about 30 years. They think that is the former things. And he's saying, no, stop harking back. Stop living in the past as if those were the glory days. It was complex. It was full of complaints. There were scarce resources. There was an absence of God. God is doing a new thing. And he never fails to do a new thing. Time's beginning to move on. You see, God in effect promises them another Exodus. But did you know in the reading, it's kind of an Exodus in reverse? The God who made a way through the sea will now make a way through the desert. The God who dried up the Red Sea will now make streams in the wasteland. He's giving them another Exodus, but it's like he's turned the Exodus on its head. The desert will bloom. It doesn't come by waiting for God to do what he did in the past again. Remember back when I was speaking about momentum? As I said, it's a science thing, but I think it's true in our lives, in our work, in our walk with God, in our church. It's easy for momentum to stall, for us to get stuck and keep on doing the old things. It's easy to fall into the trap of focusing entirely on the past, whether the past was glorious or hideous. So as a church, are you believing on and in a new thing? As the people of God, are you waiting and seeking and leaning into God to do something new now? And it may look very different from what he did in the past. Maybe our freedom and our growth does come by trusting God as he does a new thing. But lesson 2, it's impossible to gain momentum without embracing change. Just jump forward. I know it's written small. You don't need to read it because many of you will know it. Jump forward 500 or 600 years. And we come to that classic passage about the first church in the book of Acts. Imagine for a second. Imagine you are a Jew in the early New Testament. Imagine how tough it was to be told, oh, forget your past. Forget how you used to interact with God. Forget how you used to worship him. Forget all your thoughts about what the new Messiah would be like. Forget your hundreds of years of traditions. Forget about circumcision. Forget about the right thinking. Lay down your history as the people of God. Now worship him in a new way. Imagine how tough that would have been for an Old Testament Jew to hear. Forget everything that you've been taught for hundreds of years. Now worship God in a new way, baptism and repentance. What an unbelievably tough ask. Talk about having to embrace change. No wonder many, many Jews didn't do it. The hardest thing to do is for us to start off, to gain momentum. They say, again, I don't know if it's true, but they say something like 80% of all the energy that a rocket has is used just getting it off the ground and into the atmosphere. Because starting off is really hard. It's much easier to live with inertia and to give in to resistance. But maybe the third lesson is that it's impossible to gain momentum without embracing community. And of course, the follow-on passage is the classic passage in Acts about what the early church looked like. Devoting themselves to apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe with the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. And this new community, what we now know as church, this new community grew out of faith. It grew out of recognizing who Jesus was, and it took hold of the early church. There was no looking back to the past. And what occurred, what grew, was a sense of awe about what God was doing. And generosity grew beyond anything they'd experienced before. And a gratitude, yes, for the past, but also for each other as they stepped into something new. And maybe that will happen with our church too. If we step into something new, we get a sense of awe about what God is doing. We'll experience generosity beyond anything that we've experienced before, and a gratitude for each other. And as I close, maybe it's a bit of a segue into our time of communion after the next song of worship. God didn't deliver his people because they were good people. The very next verses in Isaiah point out these people have burdened God with their sins. Even when they prayed and when they offered sacrifice, their religious activities were half-hearted. That's why they were in exile. So God delivers them again, not because they deserve it, but because God is a God of grace who forgives the undeserving. Even I am he who blots out your transgressions for my own sake and remembers your sin no more. He's the one who leads them out of exile and provides water for their journey. And God redeems us time and time again. Not because of how good we are, but because he wants a people who will become good. And hold on to that, and maybe that verse, as we come to communion in just a few moments. God did a new thing for the people of Israel. And when you read the rest of Isaiah, and indeed the Old Testament, you see a new covenant is formed. A new heart and a new spirit, we read in Ezekiel. A new song, a new name even. And God's question for his exiles is perhaps a good question for us to close with. Do you not perceive it? Do you not see that I'm doing a new thing? Now it springs up. Maybe as a church, the best thing we could do is to start doing what Em has done over the past 3 months. 6 minutes alone with God. Perhaps it's a good place for us to start as we begin to pray into what God may be leading us into. For those of you who don't know your church history or your recent church history, you might have heard of the Cambridge 7. 7 men who met for 7 minutes in the late 1800s in Cambridge, just down the road. And through their university life, they met every single morning without missing a morning. And when you read who they are, they're like a who's who of the early missionary work of the church out in China and various other places. Because God moves when his people come together and pray. So it's good to remember and to celebrate the past, but don't live in it. It's impossible to gain momentum or liberation without embracing change. And it's impossible to gain momentum without embracing community. And the result? God added to their number daily those who were being saved. So I'm going to ask the worship team to come up. We're going to sing together How Deep the Father's Love for Us. And that's for us as individuals, but also for us as a church. If you haven't already got it, that may be a good time to collect your communion elements from the back, and there'll be people there who will help serve those to you if you need some help. And then we'll come together in a time of communion and worship.